here with us today.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I work on the Boston campus, but I live here just like on Packard Avenue, so I'm so glad to just be able to walk from my house here. So thank you all for coming. So I have to ask, how many of you are graduating this semester? Hey, congratulations. I hope wonderful things happen, and yeah, don't forget about us here. So I was really honored when Sarah asked me to participate in this Lunch and Learn series, and I must admit, I said, yeah, sure, what the hey, I'll do it. And then today I asked, so what is this group exactly? And so I learned a little bit more about you, and listening to the announcements, you guys are doing some interesting things here on this campus and in the community. So I am really excited to have an opportunity to share with you. So again, thank you all for this opportunity. The road to food waste is paved with good intentions. I must admit I had not really considered food waste as something that was an issue for me. I mean, of course, as a kid, I remember my mom and dad saying, don't waste food, yada, 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 and all the sometimes not helpful things when they say that we really shouldn't just clean our plates, we should be mindful. Being in the School of Nutrition, I learned we can overeat, so be careful of that. But it was an interesting thing. I actually went to a seminar, a session at a conference, the Ag and Human Values Conference, and I met some folks, particularly a woman named Ronnie Neff, who's at Johns Hopkins University, who had worked with a person at Harvard Law School, Emily Broad-Leib, on a food waste project that they were doing, and it was called The Dating Game, and it was basically arguing that date labels were problematic, and part of the reason that we see food waste that's problematic in the U.S. And when I was watching that presentation, I realized that there was a real opportunity for someone like me, I'm an economist by training, to actually provide some quantification of this qualitative data that they had collected. Not knocking what they had done, and they started a really important body of work, and I should note, and it's not necessarily advertisement, but the Harvard Law School in June, like the last week of June, is having a 2-day conference on food waste. So if you're interested in that, I can share that with Sarah, and she can share that with you all. I went to it 2 years ago, and it's a really interesting conversation that takes place there. So I encourage people who are interested in that, if you're around, to attend. So I want to tell this story about food waste from a very personal space. And I'm sure my story is not unusual compared to yours, in that there have been times when I decided I'm going to go out and make, I don't know, Tuesday's coming up. So why don't I have tacos, Taco Tuesdays? So I go shopping, and maybe I make this decision at the grocery store. So I'm bopping along, and I decide, well, let's buy some salsa. Now, I'm not a big salsa eater in general, but I decide it'll be good to have for this Taco Tuesday. The Taco Tuesday comes and goes, and actually no tacos were made. So the spaghetti sauce, the taco sauce, I'll talk about spaghetti sauce later. The salsa just sits in the back of the refrigerator and it gets kind of pushed back. Week after week goes on, and I forget about that salsa. Until one day, I actually happened to look at the salsa. And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, I was supposed to, And then I look a little closer at it, and I realize, oh, it's already past due. Boy, is it past due. It was back December 2016, and trust me, I have found things like that in my refrigerator. I'm so sorry. But I don't think my story is unusual. And one of the things that we keep seeing over and over again, and there are multiple groups that are looking at this issue about food waste, is that this realization that date labels, that little bit of information used by, best by, sell by, and a date may be influencing how we perceive the product and what we'll actually do with it in time. So this idea about food waste is something that has grown in concern over the last several years. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, who actually is funding part of this work, has estimated that in the U.S. we waste about 31% of the food along the whole supply chain. And the argument is that only about 10% happens from the farm to about production, and the other 21% is at the consumer side. Now, there is a body of literature that's developing that's calling that into question and saying, well, is it really that bad? Is it really this large? There have been other estimates that have suggested it's up to 40% of the food that comes through the food system is lost. So there are some real questions about methodological reasons, methodological issues that may suggest that it's not this bad. I'm actually on a project, another USDA project that's looking at the side of production, from production that is on the farm to the retail level, and we're starting to question whether or not it's as small as we've been suggesting, and trying to understand what are the factors that may be leading to food loss from the farm to the retailer. So, so it's an interesting project, so watch that space. There'll be more coming out. Now, to be mindful of the literature, there is a literature that's come out in the last several years, last 2 years in particular, and there's some things coming out. I mean, literally every other month there's a new paper coming out on food waste, and it's coming from multiple disciplines, from the engineering side to the economic side, what I'm dealing with, to sort of food science and food issues more broadly, to even from business to people in sociology and anthropology, thinking about how we perceive and understand waste and the mechanisms that lead us to making those choices. Now, I won't go through all of these papers, but just suffice it to say that there's this expanding literature on what is food waste. And if you'd like, I can give you some references if you want those. But one of the things that we're starting to see is questioning what is actually food waste. And there is some conversation in some economic circles to say, well, there's no such thing as food waste. I bought it, I can just throw it out, it doesn't matter. Don't lump all economists in a bad pot, okay? But it's this argument that if we purchased it, we have the freedom to do as we choose with it. Now, of course, some of that argument is ignoring the possibility that there could be externalities, that purchasing this product, not using it, could have negative consequences throughout the supply chain. And so there are arguments that we can use different things, like in the literature about behavioral economics, we can use nudges to actually encourage, or in this way, discourage people from wasting food in different settings. And we're thinking about the economic reasons that lead to food waste. And there have been some papers that even suggest that we can use an optimal tax, sort of treating it like a pollution, and that we could tax people to actually prevent some level of food waste. So there is this literature that's searching for how do we actually mitigate this problem. But this isn't just a U.S. issue. This isn't a concern that just happens to be something that's hot right now. There is a global concern about food waste and food loss, and it's called both food waste and food loss because there's generally a tendency to break this up into two components. Food waste would be more of what you and I do, what we throw away, our plate waste or what have you, and trust me, I'm not going to evaluate if you throw away your crust, okay? So there should be no pressure here. But on the other side, the concern about food loss tends to have been a story about what happens mostly in developing countries where insects or poor storage techniques may lead to some level of product being lost and having problems in that sense. So I will say that I'm going to mostly talk about, or the language I'll tend to use is food waste, but understand that there's this other world that people are also talking about. So the UN has the Sustainable Development Goals, and so this is a 15-year plan to actually improve various sectors of our world. It's building up on what were originally the development goals that ended a few years ago, and now these are the new Sustainable Development Goals. And food waste touches on several of these issues. Let's see if I can highlight, particularly ending zero hunger. There has been often a correlation between food waste and hunger or access to food. I want to be careful there. There are people who are saying, well, just because if you just remove food waste, it doesn't necessarily mean that food will go to people who are having difficulty accessing food. So we want to be careful about how we make those connections, but there is an argument to be made that it may be related. In terms of good health and well-being, there is some argument, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, that there is a different kind of food waste than just throwing away a product. If we argue that people should eat, let's say, 2,000 calories, obviously everybody is different. I mean, I literally mean everybody is different, and therefore our calorie intake is going to vary by our lifestyle, our body shape, and what have you. But if we're eating over that, could that be considered a form of food waste? This excess consumption of calories may be one of the factors leading to obesity. Maybe we can think about food waste in this manner. Of course, there's this idea of 12, which I'll get back to. Then there's the climate action, suggesting that food waste may have environmental implications, which of course would be of interest, I would imagine, to this group. But then there's this idea of responsible consumption and production. And this is actually where food waste and food loss is explicitly mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals as compared to the Millennial Development Goals previously. So the UN, and this is part of some of the concern about how we measure food waste. The argument is there are about 1.8 billion tons of food that is wasted every year. And the argument is that this overconsumption of food is detrimental to health and the environment, as I suggested earlier. About 2 billion people are overweight or obese. So if this idea of overconsumption as an indicator of food waste or as a sort of a version of food waste, reducing some of that food waste may be beneficial. And of course, the connection to the environment, to issues of sustainability, that food waste may lead to overproduction of agriculture, and therefore there is land degradation, reduction of soil fertility, effects on the marine environment. All of these factors may actually improve if we reduce our production, if we're actually producing so much that we end up wasting it. There is this argument, also all of this is coming out of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that a large portion, 30% of the world's total energy is associated with food production and consumption, and that 22% of greenhouse gases comes from this food production and consumption. So if we're overproducing, overconsuming, and throwing away product, maybe we can cut back and reduce some of our greenhouse gases. So this is the argument. Now I can say that's not the space where I exist, and I'll get to a very, very narrow space to talk about in a few moments. But I wanted you to understand why this food waste conversation is going on and why it's being considered an important one. I want to be mindful that there are some who are arguing, oh, in a few years we'll forget about food waste, we won't worry about it. But if any of these statements are true, then I think that won't happen too quickly. So I want to narrow my focus to one particular area, and that's date labels. Now, there's a group actually that comes out of the work that was going on at Harvard, as I understand it, that's called ReFed. And it's a nonprofit organization that's working with industry to figure out solutions to the food waste problem. And if you look up their website, it's ReFed, R-E-F-E-D. They have a series of areas that they think could be possible solutions to food waste, at least in the developed world, particularly in the U.S. And one of the areas that they have argued for and suggested could be a way of actually improving how we consume and manage food and a mitigation strategy for food waste is by adjusting date labels. So I'm going to take us outside the U.S. and then come back. And there's a group out of the U.K. called RAP, and I wish I could remember what the letters stand for, but I know one is I think it's waste reduction, but I can't remember what the A and P are. They have done a lot of interesting work, and they're one of the earlier people that have come out to look at food waste, at least in the UK, but even globally. And so they argue that about 20% of the food in the UK that's lost, or food waste that occurs, is because of confusion over date labels. And in the US, there are a plethora of these date labels. So I'm sure if you go around, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, you can see used by, fresh by, best by, sell by, best if used by, freshest by. I mean, you can go on and on. I was living in the South, in the state where I was living in Alabama. According to a report that was looking at the legal guidelines for date labels in the state of Alabama, there were 21 different date labels that could be possibly used, but there was no guidance on what specific label needed to be used. And we see that. I don't know if you can make out what this is. This is deli turkey meat, you know, Oscar Mayer's, not promoting a particular brand. And this is out of Stop and Shop near my house. And this is on one day, I just happened to look, this says best if used by, this says used by, this says sell by. All of these deli turkey meat, same basic product, but different date labels. So it's very clear from talking, and I've had conversations with folks who have worked in industry, and they said, oh yeah, there's no guideline. We can use whatever we want. According to the work out of the law school at Harvard, who's been looking at date labels, there is no federal guidelines for what these date labels should be or can be. Every state has different guidelines for what they are, and some of those states are very vague in what they are. Again, going back to the state of Alabama, as I understood it, there is no state regulation. There are some things that get a little more tricky when you talk about meat and meat products sometimes, depending on the state, fish products. The one thing that there is a requirement on in terms of date labels that is a federal law is on infant formula. Beyond that, it's the Wild West, even though we're in the Northeast. Never mind. So, all right. So product date labeling may have multiple influences on how consumers understand the product, how they use it, and their experience of it. So there have been some papers that have published, and so this shows that this literature is a little bit older than the last few years, but they weren't thinking about it quite in the same way as the sort of current discussion about food waste. And so the argument is that these date labels and the date, so I'm going to lump them two together, even though I should be very careful to say the date label is the used by, best by, whatever. The posted date is the actual date that's on there. I'm going to conflate them a little bit because some of the literature uses the whole date label and date, some just use the date, but suffice it to say, the information that's posted on the product has some influence, at least some of the literature points to that. And it can influence how we perceive the safety or the quality of the products that are there. It may lead to waste as we get closer to the date. It could suggest lower quality. So as we get closer to the date that's posted on the product, we may say, it's probably not going to taste as good. It may encourage waste for quality. And some work that I did with a colleague, Brad Brickert at Cornell, that actually sparked a lot of this work, is that these date labels may actually influence what we call something like the willingness to waste. It is sort of the economic value of the waste that we're allowing to go away. So again, I want to step back from just what we are talking about domestically here in the U.S. and just narrowly talking about date labels in the U.S. to say this is a conversation that's going on at a global base, on a global level. So Codex Alimentarius is a UN organization that is sort of the marriage or the collaboration between FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and WHO, the World Health Organization. And they come up with an organization called Codex Alimentarius that deals with food safety quality standards around the world. Now, typically these standards are really just minimums. They're not required. No country has to abide by them. If you deviate from them, it's not a problem. But countries generally say this is what we ought to be doing. And multiple countries around the world participate in it, both developed and developing. So this is a document that came out of some conversations, some discussions that were going on in their home base in Rome, and then happened in one of their meetings in Geneva. And this has to do with how to deal with issues of certain date labels. So if you'll see right here, sell by, they were striking out what the meaning of sell by, and they were, I think, in essence, trying to get rid of the use of sell by. And they were arguing sell by is the last date of offer to sell, for sale to the consumer, after which there remains a reasonable storage period. So it had some meaning, but all countries didn't necessarily abide by this. If we look at, there's also changes in what they were using for best before date or quality, best quality before date. I won't go into reading all of it, but it has some suggestion that there could be some difference in the quality of the product after a certain period of time. And then they have this idea of used by, or used or consumed by dates, or expires on or expires by date. And what they're doing is kind of getting rid of some language about the estimated period of shelf life, and that it should not be regarded as marketable after that date. So trying to free up these meanings, but the problem, especially with this date label, used by, is if it implies some suggestion of safety, it also assumes how consumers are actually going to use the product. If we're talking about certain products, particularly meat, if it's not handled properly, whatever date you put on it may not matter, because the bacterial growth could occur and cause problems beyond what's posted on the product. So we have to exercise extreme care in how we understand and use these date labels. And I should note that if you go back to the example of the deli turkey meat in Stop and Shop, Any date label can show up on those products. Maybe not any, but several different date labels show up. So in the US, there's actually an effort to try to harmonize these date labels. So currently, or at least in the last 2 years, there were bills in the House and the Senate to actually change these date labels. I was speaking to someone recently about this, and evidently they're trying to adjust even some of what they're trying to do there. So the effort was to make a date label for safety, which would be a used by date label, and a date label for quality, which would be, they're playing around with the language of best if used by or best by. Then there was this language, efforts by the U.S. Food Safety and Inspection Service, FSIS, that had a comment period to actually get people to decide on how to use those date labels, also centering around this quality and safety. And then there was an industry effort to actually encourage the industry to adjust their date labels. Walmart was one of the companies that came out and said, we're going to actually, for all of our Walmart brand products, we're going, I think it's great, better value, best value, I can't remember the exact name of their brand, we're going to require all, I think it was best if used by. So there has been some effort, but it is not uniform and it is not official. So one of the things that we can see of the sort of overview is that these date labels vary in their potential meaning, and there's no federal regulation on this. And as I've shown you before, the same product can have different date labels. So that's a lot of introduction. I want to get to an experiment that I ran with some colleagues. We did this in Alabama, and we also did it at Auburn University and in Ithaca, New York, at Cornell University, trying to explore how people understand these date labels. Because one of the things that I think is a challenge and that builds on some of the literature that's out there is what happens when people see no date label, how do they respond, and how they think about what their waste will be. And then what happens when you start providing them with more information? Are we seeing adjustments in how they value the product, what we'll call willingness to pay, and then how they think they'll consume the product, and what we'll back out of it is their waste rate. So what we want to understand is how do people understand the meaning of these date labels? Because if we're going to adjust how these date labels, we need to know where we start in terms of our understanding of the meanings of these date labels. And then we want to understand how the willingness to pay and how their premeditated waste is influenced by these date labels. So I'll tell you a little bit about the experimental design. So we used a BDM auction. So in economics, there's a field of economics called experimental economics, where people put, where researchers put people like you and I in experimental settings, and we try to figure out how they will respond to different bits of information, how they'll value products, and how they'll trade products. And so in this experiment, we set people in a, we put people in a, basically a computer room, and they're facing a computer screen. I'll show you a screenshot of what one of the bidding screens that they had. And we asked them to tell us how much they're willing to pay for a product. And then we'll also ask them how much they expect to consume. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But what we did was we gave them a couple of products, spaghetti sauce and deli meat, and we wanted to know their willingness to pay for those products and their premeditated waste, but we asked it in a different way. And we gave them some information about the products. There is an idea in experimental economics of avoiding deception. And deception is this idea that you're offering them something that they'll never ever have to buy, or you're just kind of playing games with them. And so we had to be very careful to avoid this concept of deception, which is something that in other fields they may use. And so we had to find spaghetti sauces that had a date label that were that was at least a year away from that day's date, and deli meat that was at least 2 weeks away from that day's date. And so we had to spend a lot of time finding grocery products that fit the description. So, so what we, as I suggested earlier, what we did was we asked them for their willingness to pay and the percentage of the product that they thought they would consume. Now, it is really complicated, and we learned this from some other colleagues, to ask people, so tell us how much of this product you think you're going to waste. Because most of us say, oh, I'm not going to waste that. But if you ask the other question, so how much do you think you'll consume? If you're really honest, and which we'll see in a few moments, people say, I won't consume all of it. I remember when, especially before I got married, that I would buy spaghetti sauce when I was a graduate student. I'd buy spaghetti sauce. I was living, even though I had roommates, we didn't really share food, so we were bad people that way, but okay. But I would buy spaghetti sauce, and I would open it up. I would use like a quarter of it, maybe 2/3, a quarter to about half, because how many days in a row can I eat spaghetti sauce? So I would end up growing mold, and I thought, well, I should have known better. So I would go to the grocery store to some degree understanding I'm not going to consume all this. Now, maybe you are better than I am. And then when I got married and realized, oh, you know, Norbert, you can actually just freeze the spaghetti sauce. I was like, my life is better. It was a good thing. I'm married to a good person. She's a wonderful woman. So anyhow, so this idea of we waste product going into the store and understanding I'm not going to actually consume it all is something that we actually see in this experiment. We did some other things in this that I won't go into. We were trying to get at some issues of risk aversions or how people handle risk and loss aversion, but that's not for today. We also did something else that's very common in these experimental settings is we had a series of survey questions at the end asking, basic social demographic variables, gender, age, education. But we also asked what they thought about different date labels and how they understood what they meant. And I want to show you that in a moment. So I realize you may not be able to see this very well, but this was sort of a bid screen that we offered. And so what you can see is that we showed them a display from a grocery store, and this was our test product. This was potato chips. And so what we had them to do was that we would go into a little description of the product, and then we would say, what we want you to do is tell us how much you're willing to pay for a bag of potato chips. And we want you to enter that in dollars and cents in this box here. And then using the slider, tell us what, from 0 to 100%, what is the most common percentage of the product you predict your household would consume? And so you can move the slider to the left or the right to indicate the amount. I will tell you right now, everyone didn't say 100%, and everyone didn't say 0. Okay. So we had values along that continuum. We asked a very specific question, and we did this in 4 different ways. And all of these things are randomized in terms of order, because order can influence how people behave, or at least you can see differences in their first bid versus other bids, and how people answer one question relative to others. So what we asked was, for sliced deli turkey meat, because remember we were looking at 2 products. I don't know why I did 3, but we were looking at 2 products, spaghetti sauce and deli meat. And so we said, for sliced deli meat, Best Buy means, and they were to use these Likert questions to say, for safety, it means, you strongly agree that it means safety to strongly disagree. Or for nutrition or quality or taste, they were to mark what they thought. Okay. So based on that, we end up developing a series of hypotheses, or we have a series of hypotheses that we're able to test through this experimental design. And so we hypothesized that there were differences in these date labels that across these attributes. So quality, safety, nutrition, taste. We said that consumers were going to respond differently when they saw used by versus when they saw Best Buy. And we said that that might actually occur even by the different products, so that they may say used by and Best Buy are different when they see spaghetti sauce, which is shelf stable, shouldn't go bad, has a long shelf life relative to deli turkey meat, which is more perishable, has a shorter shelf life. So what we were interested in understanding is, was there actually a difference in the Likert score, that 1 to 5 score of Best Buy versus used by, or used by less than Best Buy? And then we looked at it controlling for each of the attributes. Okay, so those are our core experimental survey questions that we wanted to look at, because we wanted to understand, are consumers actually confused by these date labels? And so what do I mean by confusion? In this case, confusion would mean that I am saying, in the marketplace, these date labels don't really mean much, because you could see the same date label on different products, or different labels on the same product, I should say. So if we see that there are deviations, if we reject these hypotheses, we're suggesting that there's some level of confusion about what the labels actually mean. So we also looked at the willingness to pay that we estimated, and we argued that the willingness to pay for these date labels will change once we go from a no date label setting, so they just saw the date and they knew the product, to a label that was either Best Buy or used by. And we argued that there will be a change. We're not predicting the direction of the change, but I will say we had intended, or had thought rather, that the willingness to waste would actually fall, so that this would be a positive value. So we thought it would be 0, but we just looked at, was it different than 0? We also did it with the premeditated waste. And so again, we asked how much you thought you would consume, which is in percentage terms, and we subtract that from 100 to get a percentage or a premeditated waste. And so we argued that the premeditated waste would change under these different date label scenarios. We actually thought that you would waste more once you saw information about the date labels. Yes, Lucy. So the way we talked about premeditated waste, and thank you for asking that clarification, is that once you bought the product, you thought that you weren't going to consume it all. And so by asking how much you thought you were going to consume, we were able to figure out what was going to be left over and thus what would be wasted. So let's look at some of our results. Ooh, that got really big. Okay. So forgive me, it's a little hard to see this, but what we see here are the Likert scores, the average Likert scores, and the 95% confidence intervals for each of the date labels for each product. And the key thing I think is important to see is that safety, which is the green bar, for use by is going to have the highest Likert score. Okay? So it's not surprising, and it's kind of what we would have anticipated, that people associate use by with safety because that language sort of suggests that. Again, remember, you could see different date labels on the same product. I want to talk about quality and taste are virtually the same for each one of these, so you don't really see a big difference between taste and quality for each of the date labels. But notice that for Best Buy, they tended to be larger in terms of the Likert score, so people tended to agree more with them. They thought that when they saw Best Buy, it meant more about quality and taste than the other date label, than the other attributes. And that's about safety, and we see the same thing with spaghetti sauce. But notice that the overall average of spaghetti sauce, the meaning of the date labels are lower, okay? And again, safety. So I want to just go through some results. I want to highlight a few things. Don't let all the numbers throw you off. I know you're competent and can handle that, but I want to just narrow your focus to a couple of places. So what I did was ran a couple of regressions to assess how the date labels may be influencing their perception of these, how consumers were responding to these different date labels. And this is looking at the use by. And we can see that when people saw use by, they ended up having higher Likert scores by the attributes. So this is for nutrition, this is for safety, and this is for taste. Except for taste, it's negative, suggesting that when people saw use by compared to Best Buy, they thought it was going to mean less about taste than the use by date label, than the Best Buy date label. So we're seeing that there are differences in how people perceive the meaning of these labels, suggesting that level of confusion. What we also see is that there are differences by the product, and so the deli meat had higher Likert scores overall, and that was true for across each of these products. Now we then looked at some of the demographic variables, and the only one that's significant for nutrition is income, that the higher income group tended to not think that these labels were about nutrition. But where I think you'll find more interesting is when we start looking at issues of race and age, and also children in the household. So let's look at it specifically with nutrition. We can see that whites versus non-whites tended to think less of these date labels in the space for nutrition. Age did this interesting thing where it was a quadratic relationship, so that as you were younger, you tended to agree more with the date labels. As you got to about 31, you tended to agree less and the least. And then as you got older, we saw that the sort of general belief in the date labels also increased. So it's suggesting that there's something happening as we age and we respond to these date labels differently. The last point that I think is interesting also is what happens with children. That if you have young children in your house, or at least children under the age of 18, you tend to think that the labels mean more about nutrition than others who don't have children. And this is on a number of children, so it suggests that as you have more children, you tend to be more concerned about, or at least agree more that the date labels are about nutrition. So this is suggesting something really important. This effort to try to collapse these date labels down to a use by or Best Buy or something about safety and something about quality fails to appreciate that we're going to respond differently given who we are. Now, I want to be careful. These are not causal relationships. These are at least correlations, so we need to keep that in mind. But there seems to be something going on there. The last thing I want to point out on this is that we see that there seems to be a bit of difference. I lost some stars here. Yeah, how did I lose stars? Okay, I know it's for children. Oh, I lost college and college educated. That's what it was. The college educated was statistically significant. But suffice to say, we see again with safety that the number of children also is related. So it seems that parents with kids are thinking these labels may help them think about nutrition and about safety. Depending on the level of education, which was negative, it suggests that people who had college degrees or higher tended to think less of these date labels as compared to people who didn't have college degrees. Now, I got to be careful. I want to disclose that our sample tends to be better educated than the U.S. population. There was some selection bias in terms of who participated in the experiment. So this is not nationally representative, but it does point to some issues. In the time, I think I'll skip this, but this is just to say that there are differences in the date labels and how people responded. So this is looking at the premeditated waste rate. So this is saying how much people thought they would waste given the different date labels. So the no date label is when this is what they always saw first. And so this said that people thought when there was no date label, they would waste almost 30% of the product. So again, let's back that out. That's saying people said on average they would consume only 70% of the product. Now, let's be careful here. There were some people who said they would consume none of the product, thus 100% waste. There were people who said they would consume all the product, thus zero. So what we're not seeing is some average between that where half the people said they will consume all and half said none. We see values all along that spectrum. But what's interesting is that we see that there's an increase in the waste, premeditated waste as we go to best by, and it increases, again, this is for deli meat rather, for use by. But we see something surprisingly different for spaghetti sauce, where for the no date label, we see that the rates are, in general, are lower, and it goes from 15% to about 12% for Best Buy, suggesting that when people saw Best Buy, they took that as information to say, wait a minute, this product is fine for a little while longer than I had thought. So it's a surprising result. And then we see a slight increase from that with use by for spaghetti sauce. Now, I will say that this is with the raw data. This is how much everybody said, including everybody. With this variation, what we did is we said, let's drop those people who said they weren't willing to pay anything for the products. So and we had people who said, oh, I'm not willing to pay anything for spaghetti sauce. Oh, but I'll probably eat about 80% of it. I was like, wait a minute, you're not. But we wanted to keep it in because, let's be honest, I don't buy Oreos. I'm not going to buy Oreos. But if Oreos are in my house, they will be eaten. So I kept that data in there just for the sake of the integrity of the experiment, but this is a more realistic view of it. We see that the waste rates drop, but we don't see a change in the overall pattern. This is the willingness to pay, and we see it sort of has a mirror image of what goes on, where our willingness to pay declines for deli meat as we add more information. And I want to step back and just think about that for a second. At times, we generally say providing people with more information actually should make them more likely to pay more for a product because I understand more about it. But this information is actually almost disinformation because it's suggesting that people are looking at these products differently. It's important to note that it doesn't matter the absolute value. If they said $2 or $3, what really matters is the change that happens. But with the spaghetti sauce, we see again that unusual response where it goes from the no date label, where it increases when they see Best Buy and it decreases. Now these lines are 95% confidence intervals, but I want to tell you right now, there's some funny things in the data. So there were a couple of folks who said, I'm going to pay $80 for spaghetti sauce. No, you're not. Or $100. And what we realized is in about 5 bids, I bet what happened is they thought they were putting in their premeditated, their amount they thought they would consume, 80% makes sense, but they put it in their willingness to pay. So when we drop those sort of unusual observations, we get much more reasonable results, and we get, again, that same pattern doesn't change. So let's look at some of our overall results. And so what we see here is that when people saw this is for the premeditated waste, When people saw use by, they actually thought that they would waste more. So they would waste more, but oops, they would waste less when it was spaghetti sauce. And then when we allow for the interaction, we saw that there was a negative effect. And I'll show you what the net result of that is in just a moment. When we look at the willingness to pay, we saw that there were actual, for Best Buy, we saw for both Best Buy and Use By, there was a reduction in how much people were willing to pay. And that was true for both models. I won't talk about the difference between the models. We see a little bit of difference in the spaghetti sauce. And it should be noted the market price for both the deli meat and the spaghetti sauce was the same. So it should not have been different, but people had a different perception of their willingness to pay. And we see, again, a positive value for the interaction, suggesting that the date labels are moving that when we interacted with the food. So here are the, here is the contrast. So this is saying how people responded once we compare the no date label to Best Buy or no date label to Use By. And so we can see here that spaghetti sauce, when we compare the Best Buy versus no date label, there's actually this reduction that's statistically significant. So people were willing to waste less of the product or had a lower premeditated waste when they saw Best Buy. And it was a reduction of about 13%. Now we could argue that's not a lot, but it's a reasonable amount. That here's this little bit of information. And if you saw something different, you actually cut back on your waste, or at least your premeditated waste. For the deli meat, I won't go into the details, we saw that there was about 11% increase in how much people thought they would waste, or in the premeditated waste. Now that's on the waste part, and we saw that it was all statistically significant. So when we looked at the willingness to pay, we saw that there was a reduction when people went from no date label to Best Buy for deli meat of about 9%. And then for deli meat, we saw a reduction of about 11% when it went to the Use By date label. And so what we don't see is a difference in the willingness to pay for the spaghetti sauce. So all in all, what we see is that there are changes in how people perceive they will consume the product and even how they value the product. There's some evidence to suggest from some earlier work that how we value the product may also lead to how we waste the product. So if by showing just a little bit of information change, people may change how they waste products. So last couple of points. So safety dominates and quality and taste shape beliefs across these date labels. With no date label, consumers predict they'll waste upwards of about 30%, or maybe as low as 15 or 10%. But I will say we did this in a different way than what a previous experiment that we ran. So in this one, we were asking people to solely forecast. And we didn't say anything about the past. In an earlier experiment where we said, tell us how much you're willing to consume of this product given what you've done in the past, and we end up with higher waste rates. I want to be careful to make a comparison because we weren't looking at the same product, so the comparison isn't perfect. But I believe how we ask and if you encourage people to think about their past, they'll do things, they may consume differently, or I believe they'll respond differently. We saw that there were variations in the valuations of the product by date labels, and I forgot to drop that line about risk aversion, so you didn't see that. All right. So what does this mean? I think one of the things that's important is that if we're going to talk about changing these date labels, we need to be aware that this may matter by the product category, and that different date labels have different meaning depending on level of education and how we educate people about what these products are. I'll tell you now, in my household, regardless of the fact that I'm doing this research, my wife is still not quite trusting me on this date label thing. She was like, it means something. I know it does. So what do you do? So the other thing that I want to think is important, there's been some efforts to think about how households of different income status may respond, and our data isn't rich enough to look at this carefully. But there's been some arguments that lower income households are much more likely to waste products because of concerns about the safety and can't take the risk of getting sick from a foodborne illness, or at least the perception of that. There are others who said lower income households are much less likely to waste products because they're much more cautious about what products they bring into their household. There was some research by sociologists out of Harvard who was looking at introducing new foods to children. And the argument went that children are if you're in a low income household, you're less likely to offer new foods to your child because you want to avoid waste. Because it takes so many introductions of a product before a child will consume it or like it. So that was a lot. Thank you. This is from World War II about encouraging people not to waste food. So I've used a lot of time, but I'll take some questions in the last bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilson. I had a question. So something I kind of have in my head is that with date labels, it's kind of, because I kind of think about food waste in the context of it's a business and there's corporations who are trying to minimize the amount of liability that they have when they're putting out these products. So it's like they can't guarantee freshness, or they can't guarantee that there won't be a bacteria growth or something like that in the food after a certain date, but there's also not a guarantee that it won't be fresh after that date. So that's kind of how I've always viewed date labels. So can you speak to that at all? Does that resonate?
So I don't know all of the legal guidelines about this in terms of the concern about liability, but that has been an issue that's been raised. And you're exactly right in that there is no way that a company can guarantee that you're going to handle a product, or I can handle a product properly after we've purchased it. And there's lots of things that happen from once it leaves the manufacturer, once it's in the grocery store, lots of hands have touched this product, so we're not 100% sure what these labels could possibly mean. So even if you say, I'm going to guarantee this product is safe, you can't, because you don't know all the things that happen in between. So most of our food, I would say the grand majority, is going to be safe. With proper handling, there's not going to be a problem. But can you guarantee that? But one of the things that I think that I've discovered, and how some of those labels are actually, the dates are actually determined, is really about the quality. It's about the flavor profile. So a lot of what I've heard from people associated with the industry is it's not about safety per se. It's more about, can we guarantee that when you open your box of Cheerios that it's going to taste the way Cheerios ought to taste? And so some of this, and some of the dating that has been established was, they would, as I've understood it, is that they would expose people to a product that's been a month after a certain period of time, 2 months, 3 months, and like, well, how's the crunch? How's the flavor profile? And so a lot of this is, again, not about the safety. But you're right, food manufacturers are really cautious about the possibility of foodborne outbreak. I mean, we just know about what happened with eggs. So people are very concerned about that, which is beyond date label. So that was a long kind of meandering response, but hopefully that was helpful.
I have a similar question about industry and why would they have an incentive to have less conservative dates? Because if you say it's going to go bad sooner, then you get more product through the shelves, and people, like, they're making more money that way. So yeah, I remember so I can only say to that, I remember asking a very similar question the first time I heard this discussion about date labels, and people were like, oh, no, that's not the issue. And I was like, well, how do we know? I don't know. And so I think there's a real interesting space. I actually teach a class on the food industry, and you would think I would have asked somebody, because I have speakers from various food companies come in, and I've never gotten to an answer to that question. But I would imagine that food companies want to be very careful that they don't have a quality deterioration that causes consumers not to buy the product again. But you also don't want dates that are so close because people will leave it on the shelves. So there's a careful line to walk with the date labels on the products.
I wanted to add something and a sort of question. What I wanted to add is, he told me before the talk that he actually would be willing to accept an undergrad in his class at Friedman. So if you're interested in this, you may want to talk to him. Yeah. My comment, question, thought, is that since we had the symposium on unintended consequences of the food systems, I was wondering, I was thinking while you were talking about premeditated waste, people know that they're going to consume 30% or whatever from the product, which made me think, well, maybe people looking at this could think of, we should make smaller containers, smaller portions. But then I thought, maybe that's not such a good idea, because then you are having all sort of waste.
No, actually, I think the container size, in a previous paper that my colleagues and I published, we were looking at actual product size, and we saw that, and there's an interesting conversation to be made on 2 points. So one, people tend to think if I buy the larger size, I'm saving money on the unit price, because on the per unit, per pound or per ounce basis, it's less expensive. And that can be true, and it's not true for all products, but it can be true. But what we found is that in that experiment, we found that people thought they would waste more of the larger size. So they were trying to save money on one side, but then the other side, they were throwing away the product. It was like, wait a minute. And so I think that happens. One of the things that we kind of thought would help is, again, going back to my example of spaghetti sauce. Do I really need a 24-ounce jar of spaghetti sauce? Okay, yeah, sure, I could freeze it. I learned that later. But it might have been helpful if I had a smaller size. And this idea of package sizes are really lumpy. That is, you go from like a really small version, like if you got the single serving of yogurt, to the big tub. And depending on how you consume these products, maybe you need something in between. So there could be some benefits of having different sizes, but of course that means food manufacturers got to create all these different sizes and market those, and where's the shelf space and what the product is going to move best. And so there are lots of factors that go into it, but I do believe there is some potential for adjusting those sizes.
So I think we're going to leave it at this since it's 1 o'clock. So thank you once more for your
Thank you all.
I just wanted to say you've got outstanding presentation.